The weather where I live is absolutely crazy right now. We have thunderstorms, tornado warnings, snow, literally everything you can think of is going on right now. So I'm thinking, why don't we look towards Mars? See what the weather's like there, because right now I'm thinking it's probably going to be better than here. So I enlisted the help of the absolutely amazing Kevin Powell to create the HTML and CSS for this Mars weather app. And today, we're going to take the JavaScript portion and actually make this HTML and CSS function and give us the live weather of Mars. So let's get started now. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. So if that sounds interesting, make sure you subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this one. To get started, I have all of the code that Kevin created in his videos open up on the left-hand side of the screen, and the output of that code open on the right-hand side of our screen. And as you can see, we have this really nice looking weather app, but all of the data is just placeholder data. And if you are interested in figuring out exactly how Kevin created this, make sure you go over to his YouTube channel. I'm going to have linked in the description below, where you can watch his videos where he built out all of this. But if you want to just jump in straight to the JavaScript, you can also go to the GitHub linked in the description to get the exact code as you see it on my screen, so you can start exactly where I am. Now for us, what we want to do is actually hook this up to an API that gives us live weather updates from Mars. And luckily for us, NASA has an API which is going to give us live updates straight from Mars, which actually gives us the weather on Mars. And this API is kind of cumbersome to use. It's got really annoying key names and stuff to deal with, but I'm going to show you exactly how we can break this down and use this API. So the first thing I want to do is just hook our app up to the API and start fetching data from it. And we can use this API URL right here. So let's just click on this, make sure we copy this URL because this is going to give us the data. And for your purposes, you're going to want to get a special API key. Right now, the API key is just the demo API key, but you can get your own API key by just searching for NASA API. So now let's open up our JavaScript file. As you can see, Kevin's already done a little bit of JavaScript just to make this toggle section down here actually function. So that's nice. But what we want to do is actually get the API working. So we have that API URL. We're just going to call it API URL, and just set it to that URL that we just copied over. And we're going to take our API key out of here, and we're going to set that into its own variable, which we're going to call API key, just like that. And now inside of this API URL, let's just inject that API key back in there by using string interpolation. This way, when you update your own API key, all you have to do is paste it in right here, and you don't have to change anything else with this code. Let's just remove some of these comments that Kevin has in here. And now with that out of the way, we can actually work on querying this API. So what we want to do is just create a function. We're just going to call this getWeather. And what this is going to do is it's just going to query that API by using fetch. So we're just going to say fetch here. We're going to fetch that API URL. And then all we need to do is just call .then. This is going to give us a response. And we just want to convert that response to JSON by calling res.json. Next, what we can do is we can do another then. This one is going to contain our data. And this is just going to be the data from the API, essentially all of this JSON that you see here. And we're just going to log that out for now to see exactly what we're working with. So if we inspect our page, go to our console, and we make sure that we call this getWeather function, we should see that we have a bunch of different information being printed out straight from the API. You can see we have information for day 451, 452, 453. These are called souls. They're the individual days of the cycle of Mars. And as you can see here, we have our soul keys, which correspond to those days up here. And then finally, we have this validity checks section, which for our use cases, we're just going to ignore because we're just going to trust the data that we are given to us from the NASA API. So in order to parse out this data into the information we want, which as you can see in our case, we want to get the soul number, we want to get the actual high and low temperature, as well as if I increase my screen size here, you see that we want to get the wind speed, and we need to be able to convert these between Celsius and Fahrenheit. Now everything in this API is going to be in Celsius, so all these values are Celsius, so we just make sure that we keep that in mind when we're querying this API. And really all of the information we want is inside of these numbered sections, 451, 452, 453, and so on. So we're just going to parse out just these numbered sections for all of the information we need. So in order to do that, let's just put this off to the side so we can see our API data. And what we need to do inside of here is get all of these different numbered sections. And a really easy way to do that is by using the deconstructor property as well as the spread operator, which I'll show you right now. So let's just say const here, and we're going to define a bunch of different variables based off of our data variable here. So we're going to destructure our data into multiple different variables. Our first one is going to be our soul keys, which is this property down here. Our next one is going to be for our validity checks. So just type in validity checks. And then what we can do is we can say we want to get everything else, which is all of these different numbered sections. So we can just put a triple dot here and call it whatever we want. In our case, we'll call it soul data. So this soul data variable is going to be everything in 451, 452, and so on, essentially everything that's not soul keys and that's not validity checks. This is just a quick way to get the exact data that we want. And if I print out that soul data, you can see we have here just an object with only the different keys that we want, essentially each one of the days of Mars. Now the next thing that I want to do is I want to take this data, which is in this really difficult to use format, and I want to just take out the exact pieces of information that we need and save them in a new object. So if we just check here, you can see, as you remember, we need our temperature, high and low, our wind speed, as well as which soul we're on. So inside of here, AT, that's our atmospheric temperature. So we can get our minimum, which is MN, and our maximum. So let's make sure that we do that. And in order to loop through all of this different data, all we need to do is say object.entries. This is going to allow us to loop through an object, which we can pass in our soul data object. And then we just want to map this, which essentially is going to convert one set of information into another set of information. Make sure this says entries here. And this map is going to take in the different properties from our soul data. Our soul data, when we call entries, is going to be an array where the first value is the key, which in our case is 451. And the second value is everything in the object. So all this AT, HWS, pre, all of that stuff. So what we can do is actually just destructure that into our soul, which is the key, and our data, which is everything else. And then we just want to call a function with that information. And inside of here, all we want to do is return a new function which has the information that we want. So if you remember, we want our soul. So we're going to say soul. We want to get our maximum temperature. So we'll call it max temp. And that is our data.at. If we open this up, we have mx for max. So we'll say mx here. We can get our min temp, which is data.at.mn for our minimum. Next, we're going to need to be getting our wind speed, which comes from HWS. This stands for horizontal wind speed. So we can say wind speed. We're going to get data.hws, and we just want to get the average, which is AV, because we don't have a minimum or maximum shown. We just show an average value across the entire day. Next, we need to make sure we get the degrees for our wind, because as you can see, we have this little icon here which shows the direction the wind is blowing. So we want to get our wind direction in degrees. And this is going to be data.wd. Inside of here, this is our wind direction. And we have this most common section, which is essentially like our average. So we can call most common. And then we want to get the compass degrees. That's going to give us the degrees of our wind. And also we want to make sure we get this compass point. So that way we have a way to tell screen readers, so people that cannot see this nice icon, exactly which direction the wind is going. So we're going to do that again, which is just going to be called wind direction cardinal, which is just saying which direction it's coming from, which is going to be data.wd.mostCommon. And this one is the compass point. Just like that, that's going to be this south-southeast designation right here. And then lastly, I want to get the date that this happened, because as you can see here, we're printing out the actual date on Earth as well as the date on Mars. So we just want to make sure we get that date. We're just going to call it date here. And we can just convert this value inside of here, which is, if we scroll up, first UTC. So we can just convert that first UTC by calling data.first UTC. And this new date is just going to convert this string value into an actual date we can use with JavaScript and print out to the screen like this. And with that, what we can do is we can actually just print out what gets returned from this. So we can come in here and we can say that we just want to set this to a variable. We'll say temp, because this is just going to be temporary. And then down here, we can just console.log our temp variable. And if we save, you can see now we have just a array of objects, and each one has the exact information we want: the sol, max and min temperature, wind speed, wind direction, the direction cardinality, as well as an actual date that we can use with JavaScript. So in order to use this information, instead of just logging it out, let's make sure that we return this from our .then, and we also want to return our promise from getWeather. And then when we call getWeather, it's returning a promise, so we can just say .then, and our value being returned is this array right here that we know is going to be our list of all of our different sols. So as soon as we're done getting our weather, our sols are going to be in here. And again, I can just log this out, save, and we get the exact same array being printed out. So now this getWeather function is essentially done, and the exact data we need is coming into this .then portion when we call getWeather. So now we have the array of all of our different sols exactly where we want it. And now with that data, by default, I want our latest sol to be displayed here as our main sol section. So essentially the most recent date I want to display here, and our most recent date is just going to be the last sol in our list. So we can have a variable which we're just going to call selected sol index. This is the one that's currently being displayed in this large overhead section because we have all these other sols down here, and we want to display our overarching one up here in this large section. So that selected sol index is just our sols.length minus 1. This is going to give us the very last index in our array. And I also want to make this a global variable because we want to be able to access this selected sol index from anywhere in our application. So let's just put our selected sol index up here and then just redefine that value down here. So now it's a global variable available in any of our different functions. So now that we have that, I want to be able to display that specific selected sol. So let's create a function to do that. We're going to call this function display selected sol, and this is going to take in the array of all of our different sols, and we can just call that here, display selected sol with all of our sols. And the first thing I want to get is our selected sol, and this selected sol is just going to be equal to our sols array, and we want to get from that selected sol index. So this value here in this variable is going to be whichever sol is currently selected, or by default, it's going to be the very last sol. And we can prove that by just logging it out. If we inspect over here, you'll see that we have just an individual object, which is the very last sol in our sols array. So now we can take the information from this, for example, our sol number, our temperatures, wind speed, wind direction, and our wind direction cardinality, and put all of that information into our HTML. But in order to do that, we need to modify our HTML so that we can select each one of these different sections to place the exact data that we want. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to open up our index.html, and inside of here, we'll scroll down a little bit until we find our section, for example, right here, where we have our sol being displayed. And in order to display a specific sol here, instead of always 377, what I want to do is just delete this 377 that shows up by default. And instead, I'm just going to have a span inside of here, which is going to have a data attribute, which is called current sol. And now we can select this data attribute inside of our JavaScript. So when we save, you can see that default value has disappeared, which is exactly what we want. And now inside of here, what we can do is we can create a selector, which we can just call current sol element. And we're going to set that to document.query selector. And we're going to select for that exact data attribute, which is data current sol, sol, just like that. And now this current sol element we can use instead of our display selected sol. We can set the inner text to be equal to selected sol.sol. Now when we save, you can see that number 457 is being printed out right onto our HTML. So we're getting the information from the API and actually printing out that exact sol to our HTML just like this. Now the next thing to do is going to be the exact same thing, but for our different temperature sections, as well as for our wind speed. So let's go over to our index and do that now. The first thing we need to set is our date. So instead of here, we can say data current date and just delete the default date. And if we save, that date goes away. Next is going to be our temperature section. I'm going to break this onto a few different lines to make it easier to work with. Just like that. In our -20 section, we want to replace this with a span again. And this span is going to have a data attribute. And this one is going to be called current temp. And this one's going to be our high temperature. So we'll say current temp high. And for our low temperature right here, we're going to do essentially the exact same thing, but instead of having our current temp high, we're going to use current temp low. So we're just going to replace this with current temp low. Now the last few sections we have is our wind section. So here we have our wind speed, which we're going to need to modify. So again, I'm just going to put this on multiple lines to make it easy to work with. We're going to use a span here, and this one is going to say data wind speed. Lastly, all we need to do is have our wind direction, which is down here. So we'll say data wind direction arrow. This is that red arrow you see on the right-hand side of the screen, which will point in whichever direction we want. And as you can see, Kevin's left a note saying that there's a direction custom prop on that, which we can change in order to change which way this arrow faces. And then lastly, there's this screen reader only section. So this will get read out to people on a screen reader. So what we want to do here is just delete the default and put in our selector, which is going to be data wind direction text. And that's that south, southeast, or northeast number that we saved inside of our JSON. We're going to place that inside of our screen reader only section. So now with that, that's all of the HTML changes we need for our top section. And as you can see, all of our default values have disappeared. So now it's time to jump into our JavaScript, pull out all of our selectors for that, and start placing in those new values from the API. So first, let's just copy this down because we're going to do a bunch of selectors here. We're going to do our current date element, which is going to be data current date, just like that. We're going to have another one, which is our current temp high. And we're going to call this current, temp high. And we're going to do the exact same thing, but for our current temp in the low direction. So copy that down, copy it down another time, which for all of our wind sections. So we're going to have wind speed element, and here it's going to say data wind speed. We're also going to have another one here, which is going to be, wind direction text. We can remove this element section here. And also we can remove current from these because there's only one place that we display wind. So we don't need to specify current because it's always going to be the current. And here we can say direction text. And then lastly, we're going to have our arrow. So we're going to say wind direction arrow, and here wind direction arrow. So that's all of our selectors for the different elements in our JavaScript that we're going to customize. So now inside of our display selected soul, let's just set them to the values we pulled from the API. So the first one we have is our current date element dot inner text. And we're just going to set that to our selected soul dot date. Next, we're going to have our current temp high element, and we want to get the inner text here and select our selected soul dot max temp. We'll copy that down because our temp low is nearly identical, but this is just going to be our min temp. Next, we're going to have our wind speed element. We want to get the inner text of this one as well and set that to our selected soul dot wind speed. And we're going to do a very similar thing for our wind direction arrow. But this time, instead of actually specifying inner text, what we want to do is specify a style because we want to set that custom property. So we can say style.set property. And remember that property name is just -- direction. And in here, we can set this to our selected soul dot wind direction in degrees, but we need to make sure we convert this to a degree value. So let's just come in here and use string interpolation. We'll just put in here the selectors so that we have our value being printed out, and then we can just put DEG at the end to convert this to a degree value inside of CSS. The very last thing we have is our wind direction text. And this, again, we can just set our inner text to our selected soul.wind direction text. Actually, not text, sorry. Cardinal. There we go. And if we save, you can see a bunch of things happen. Immediately, our temperatures are being displayed high and low. We have our wind speed being displayed, and the arrow is updated correctly, and our date is being displayed. But you'll notice almost none of these values are very well formatted. We have a bunch of decimal places on all of our different formats, and this date is absolutely massive. So instead, what I want to do is actually change this so that we can have nice display formats for all of our different values. The very first thing I want to change is going to be our date. Let's just create a function called display date which is going to take in a date and then give us a nicely displayed version of it. So we'll create that function display date, which takes in a date. And all we want to do is return date.toLocale date string. And this function is going to take two different properties. The first is the locale you want to convert to, so essentially what language you want, or you can pass in undefined and it'll determine the language based on the user's browser and what defaults they have set. Next, what you want to do is we want to say that we want the day format of this to be in numeric format, so we just want a numbered day, and we want our month to be in the format of long, so we want to display out the full month name. Now if we save, you can see we get March 9th being printed out. That already on its own is looking much better. Now next, let's take a look at doing a display version of our temperature. So we'll say display temperature, and we're just going to do that for both of our different temperatures. Come down here for our minimum temperature and do the exact same thing. And I'm just going to make this a little bit wider so it's easier to see. It'll just scrunch up the side of our screen just so our JavaScript code is neater and easier to read. So we're going to have that display temperature function, which is going to take in a temperature. And all we're going to do for now is return math.round, and we just want to round that temperature. So we'll say temperature. And if we save, you can see immediately we're getting whole numbers instead of getting decimals, which is exactly what we want. Let's do a very, very similar thing, but for our display speed. So we can say display speed, which is going to take in a speed, is just going to round our speed. And the reason right now that I have these in two separate functions is because eventually we need to convert between Celsius and Fahrenheit. As you can see down here, we have this toggle. We need to be able to convert between these different values, and temperature and speed have different conversion rates, which is why they're in different functions, even though right now they do the exact same thing. So let's use that display speed function to get our wind speed rounded. And if we save, you can see that the top portion of our website looks really good. We have all of our different displays being nicely rounded. It's coming directly from the API and everything looks good. But you'll notice this previous 7 days section is still full of placeholder data. We need to replace this with actual real world data. In order to do that, let's go into our HTML, widen this back out, and scroll down to this section called previous days. This is where each one of the previous days is displayed, and they all have this class previous day. And what we want to do is just take one of these previous days, copy it out, and we're going to put it down into its own section for now. Fix this indentation. There we go. And all we want to do is remove everything else inside of this previous days section. So we're just going to delete all of these different days that currently exist. And we're just going to set a class to this, or I'm sorry, a data attribute, and we're going to call this data previous souls. And then this section, what we're going to do is actually wrap this inside of what's called a template. So we're just going to say here, template, and this is going to have a data attribute, which is previous soul template. And the nice thing about templates is they don't actually get rendered to the page. These templates are just able to be used inside of JavaScript because we can use this selector that we put on this template in order to select this inside of our JavaScript. So now if we save, you'll notice that this previous days section is empty, which is exactly what we want. And all we need to do is modify our HTML down here slightly in order to make it so that each of our sections in our HTML is able to be modified in JavaScript. Essentially, we need to do the same thing down here that we did all the way up in this section for our current temperatures and such. So we need to do this for our current soul. Let's just break this out, just like we did before, onto multiple lines. We're going to have a span here, which is going to have a data attribute, which is just going to say data soul. We're going to have another thing here for our date, data date. Let's just remove this placeholder date. We're going to do a similar thing for our temperature. So let's come down here, put these onto multiple lines, just so it's easier to work with. And we can come in here with a span. With a data attribute, we're going to call this one data temp high. And we're going to do almost exactly the same thing for our low section. So let's just break these onto multiple different lines. And we want to just copy over this selector, but we're going to call this temp low. And then very finally, all the way down here, we need to have a data select button for this more info. Because when we click more info, we want to change our current soul up in this top section to whichever one is currently selected by this more info button. So now we can save, and you'll still notice down here we have nothing in our previous 7 days. That's okay for now because our actual HTML is going to be generated by our JavaScript. So the first thing we need to do is create a function which is going to allow us to display those previous souls. So we'll just call it display previous souls, and it'll again take in the list of all of our souls just like we've done up here. And all we need to do is display every single one of those souls. But we first need to get a selector for all of those different attributes that we just specified in our HTML here. So we can scroll up. I'll create a new section for these, just kind of to make it obvious that this is our first section of attributes up here. Then the second section is for our previous attributes. And luckily for us, there's only two different attributes we need to select. We need to get our previous soul template. This is that template tag that we created, which has all of our different HTML. And this is just document.query selector. And we have a data attribute on this called data previous soul template. And we need to do essentially the exact same thing, but this is going to be for our previous soul container. And this will just be previous soul container. And then here we have data previous souls as our data attribute selector. And this is just that list right here where we're going to put all of our different souls from this template. So now that we have those selected, we can save, come all the way down here. And then inside of this function, the first thing I want to do is take our container and I just want to clear it out. We're going to set the inner HTML to nothing. This will essentially remove everything inside of that container. And if you save and look over here, you can see it's empty because by default, it's going to be empty. But if we put some content inside of here, let's just put random content like that, you'll see that this content is here. But as soon as we call this display previous souls function, just like this, pass in our souls, you'll see that that content is now gone. So essentially everything inside of here is being deleted by our JavaScript. This is really nice because every time we call this, we want to start with a fresh empty container. Now the next thing to do is to loop through each one of our souls. So we can say soul for each, and this is going to have our soul data as well as the index of the element inside of our array. So we have our actual array value and then the index of the array itself. And inside of here, we're going to create a new object called soul container. And this is going to be from our template. So we can say previous soul template. And all we want to do is get the content inside of here. Dot content. And what we want to do is call clone node and pass in true. Essentially, this is going to clone all of this HTML, including all of the different nesting. And it's going to put that into this soul container variable that we just created. Now with that soul container, we can do query selectors in order to select all of these different attributes. For example, DataSoul, DataDate, and set the values we want. So let's just do DataSoul first. And all I want to do is set the inner text of this to be equal to our soul data.soul. And let's just look at what we have so far. When I save and I open this bottom section up, you'll see that nothing is being generated. And that's because I first need to take our previous soul container and I want to append a child, which is going to be our soul container, and just make sure we do that inside of our loop. Now, if I open this section up, you can see we have a bunch of different souls. We have 451, 452, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Essentially, all of our soul values are being displayed in this previous soul section. The reason it looks so ugly right now is my screen size is just super small. It's just to make the JavaScript easier to work with. But if I expand this out, you can see it looks much better and much easier to reason with. So now that we know that everything is working, let's do all of the rest of our data. We next need to select our soul container. We need to get our query selector. And again, we're going to select our date this time. So we'll use data date. And we want to set the inner text. And we already have that display date function. So we can use soul data.date and that display date function. And now down here, we also have the date of our section being printed out, which looks really good. Next, let's do our temperatures. So we can have our soul container, query selector, and we're going to get our data temp high. And in here, we'll set our inner text equal to our display, temperature. And we want to pass in our soul data.max temp. Let's do the exact same thing for our temp low. And instead of max, we want to get our minimum temperature. Now, if we look down here, you can see our high and our low temperature are being set for each one of our different sections, which is great. The last thing that we have to do is our select more button. We need to make it select our current soul. So in order to do that really easily, we can just select that button. We already put a data selector on it, so we can say data select button. And we want to add an event listener to this. And every time that we click this button, we want to run a specific function. And in this function, we want to take that global variable, which is our selected soul index, and set it to the current index that we're on in our array. And then we also want to call a function called display selected soul, which is just this function up here to display the individual soul we have currently selected. And we pass it in all of our different souls. And now if I change this period here to a comma and I save, and I come down here and I select, for example, 453, you can see all of our data in the top section has changed to 453. If I change 455, you can see this is updated for 455 and so on. Each one that I select is going to update the data in the top section of our page, which is really, really good news. Most of our application is actually complete at this point, but you'll notice one big problem is this toggle doesn't actually do anything. And even when we click the middle, it doesn't actually slide left to right. So first, let's handle the situation of clicking on the middle of this toggle and making it actually toggle left to right. So inside of our HTML, let's find that toggle. Here it is. And we have our unit toggle class. Let's add a data attribute called unit toggle onto it. So we can select this inside of our JavaScript. So we can say that our unit toggle is equal to document.query selector. We want to get that data unit toggle. And now whenever we toggle this, we can call certain functions. So inside of our get weather, let's just say unit toggle. And what we want to do is add an event listener. And whenever we click this function, or click this button, we want to run this specific function. And now inside of this function, all we want to do is change our toggle from the left to the right. And in order to do that, we have two different radio buttons with these different inputs. One has an ID of FAH, one has an ID of CEL, and all we want to do is toggle which one is checked. So to do that, we need to first get those different elements. So we can say const metric radio is equal to document.get element by ID, and we know that this one is called CEL. We're going to do the exact same thing for our imperial radial. So imperial radial, this one is going to be called FAH, just like that. And now with these different metric and imperial radial buttons, we can come inside of this selector and we can say that our metric units is going to be equal to our metric radio.checked. So if our metric radio is currently checked, we just want to uncheck it. So we're going to change our new metric units to the opposite of our metric radio.checked. Then we're going to set our metric radio.checked equal to those metric units. And we'll do the exact same thing with our imperial radio.checked. We're going to set this to the opposite because obviously this is going to be, right here, units, it's going to be unchecked whenever we want our metric units, and it'll be checked whenever we do not want our metric units. Now if I save and click this middle section, you'll see our toggle properly goes between the two different values, which is exactly what we want. And we can click the F and C, and that also toggles our units. But obviously we have one big problem. When I have this set to Fahrenheit, everything is still in metric units. We see Celsius, we see kilometers per hour, so we need to modify that. So let's create a function to do that. This function is simply just going to be called, if we scroll down here a little ways, function update units. And what this function is going to do is it's going to get all of our different Celsius units that are on our screen, as well as all of our different kilometer per hour units on the screen, and change them to miles per hour or to Fahrenheit, depending on which one it is selected. So in order to do that, we need to go to our HTML and find all of the places we use these units. So right here, for example, we have this C icon. So I want to change this here to be inside of a span, which has a data attribute, which is going to be called temperature unit. And let's just actually call that temp unit to make it easier to work with. And we'll close off that span, just like that. We're going to do the exact same thing with this Celsius unit. For our kilometers per hour, we want this to be a speed unit instead. And then if we scroll down here even further, we're going to have our temperature units here. So we want a temp unit and our temp unit. So now when we save, you see all of our units are gone, which is okay for now, because what we can do is inside this update units function, we can actually set our specific units. So let's go ahead and do that. We can say const speed units is going to be equal to document.query selector. We want to get every single one of them. And we can just say in here, data speed unit, which is that selector we just created. Let's do the same thing for our different temp units. This will just say temp here. And all we want to do is loop through each one of these. So we'll say speed units dot for each. And for each one of these units, what we want to do is call unit dot inner text. And we want to set that to a specific value. Let's just come in here and do this on a new line to make it easier to read. And all we want to do is check. We're going to use a function called isMetric. This is going to tell us whether or not we have our Celsius box checked or not. And if isMetric is true, then what I want to do is just return here kilometers per hour. Otherwise, if it's false, I want to return miles per hour. Let's copy this and do the exact same thing for our temp units, but instead we're going to have a big C for Celsius and a big F for Fahrenheit. And then let's create that function, which is just called isMetric. And this function is really simple. We're just going to return here our metric radio.checked. And we can actually use this isMetric function all the way up here inside of our click event. So we can just come in here and use isMetric instead. And now we can call that update units function. And if we save, you can see all of our unit icons as well as over here are properly set. And when we toggle to Fahrenheit, you see that nothing actually happens. And that's because if we scroll over here a little ways, we are not actually calling this function inside of this unit toggle. So let's just come down here and say update units, just like that. And now when I click this, you see it toggles between Fahrenheit and miles per hour and Celsius and kilometers per hour. But there's a slight problem, and that is when I click Fahrenheit or Celsius directly, it doesn't actually toggle. And that's because this is linked specifically, if I scroll up here, to these individual inputs. So we need to create event listeners as well on our metric radio. So we're going to add an event listener here for change. And what this event listener is going to do is just very simply call this update units function. And we're going to do the exact same thing for our Fahrenheit. So we can say, imperial radio.add event listener for change. And it's just going to very simply call the exact same function, which is update units. Now when we click on the F, it's going to properly change, the C will properly change, and the middle selector also changes. But of course, there's another problem, and that is that we're not actually changing the values inside of our thing because -9 Celsius is obviously not the same as -9 Fahrenheit. But luckily, this is actually really easy to fix. If you remember, all the way down here, we have our display temperature and speed values. So now we can just do our conversion inside of these functions. So we already know by default, all of our values for temperature are going to be in Celsius. So let's just create a temporary variable, which we'll call return temp, and we're going to set it to our temperature. And then I just want to have a really simple if check here. Essentially, if we are not metric units, so we'll say if it's not metric, then what we want to do is just inside of here, we want to take our return temp and we want to set it equal to our temperature minus 32. And then we're going to multiply that by 5 divided by 9. This is just the conversion between Celsius and Fahrenheit. So now we can use that return temp down here inside of our rounding. And if we save and we make sure that we re-render our selected soul and previous souls every time we update our units. So let's copy this code into here and all of these other different sections. So we'll copy it into here and we'll copy it, right into here as well. Now if we save and toggle to Fahrenheit, you can see our temperature properly updates, but we need to make sure we work on our wind speed next. So in order to do that, we can do a very similar thing. We can create a temporary variable called return speed, set it to our speed, and then we can do that if check by saying if it is not metric, so is metric, then what we can do is take our return speed and we can convert this. So we can just say our speed divided by 1.609. This will convert us to miles per hour. And then we can just round that return speed. So now when we toggle to Fahrenheit, we get our speed set in miles per hour. And you can see down here, these temperatures also all update, which is exactly what we want. And we can still change between them. So everything in our app is working as expected. And that's all it takes to create this Mars weather app. If you enjoyed this, make sure that you check out Kevin's portion of the video, which will be linked over here, and subscribe to my channel as well as Kevin's for more videos just like this. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.